Emerita of Housing at the University of York. She was previously Director of the Centre for Housing Policy at York and Course Director of the MSc Diploma in Housing at the London School of Economics. She specialises in social housing, neighbourhoods and inequality. Her first research job was as assistant on a 1995 study on the 20 estates we're talking about tonight. So a really good long-term view of the success of public housing. So just before we move on to the talk, I'd remind you that we will be having a Q&A session after Becky has finished speaking. So you can go to the Q&A box down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and ask a question, and I'll read them out and hopefully you'll get an answer. So anyway, Professor Tunstall, she's drawing on a unique archive and also hundreds of resident voices to trace the story of these 20 estates from the early 20th century to today. And she includes in her list 11 from London. So I look forward to hearing about those. So Professor Tunstall, over to you.
Oh, many thanks, Peter, and welcome to everyone joining today. I hope you've had a good day in the sun and that you're sitting comfortably. As Peter said, my first job in housing research was as a lowly research assistant on a project looking at these 20 estates. And I've tracked them ever since, and I feel I know them well, and I'm really delighted to get the chance to share this sort of long-term view with you today. So these 20 estates, they were built from the 1920s through to the 1970s. They're all over the country, from London, as Peter said, the Midlands, the Northeast, the Northwest. They range in size from 300 homes to 2,000 homes, and they cover all built forms from houses to low-rise flats to deck access and high-rise estates. So by the late 1970s, whatever their age, this group of estates, like a minority of all social housing estates at the time, were starting to show problems. They'd become unpopular, and there are a whole range of other things that were going on, going from high crime to vandalism to marginalised populations and physical problems as well. And my former colleague Anne Power of the LSE started work at that time in the late 70s and early 80s, looking at this group of 20, which were selected as places that had problems that were typical of other estates with problems, but by no means typical of all council housing at that time. And she chose them because the local authorities had started to do some small initiatives, mostly getting started with introducing local management into the estates. And she visited the estate several more times, and I joined in from 1995. And in the end, we've managed 6 waves of research with the estates. And as Peter said, it's amounted to several hundred interviews with resident representatives, local housing managers, and a whole range of other people, from vicars to community workers to police officers, and lots of other residents as well. And I've also gone back in time using local history archives to explore the roots of the estates in their early years, and brought things right up to date with government data and also novel sources like social media posts. So as I said, I could talk for hours and hours about this, and I'm going to try and be brief today. If you want the long version, I've actually got a very fat book here that you could get later. But I'm going to try and boil it down today to about 6 main points. And I'm now going to turn into a very small comical egg in the corner of your screen while I attempt to show you some images. So make allowances for my technicalities here. Okay, here we go. So point number 1 I'd like to make of the 6 tonight is that there are many valid and contradictory viewpoints on estates as places to live, both these 20 estates and all social housing estates, both as places to live and as social investments. And I'd like to start off with some images of literal viewpoints to make this clear. So you will have seen this image before in the publicity for the talk. It's one of the estates in London. pictured in the late 1960s when it was very new, and you might be able to spot the young trees there, the rough ground that's only...
We're not, I'm afraid we're not picking up the image at the moment. So
oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Let me go back. Okay. I'm so sorry. I thought it might be a bit tricky for me to manage this, but here we go. How about this?
That we've got screen sharing at the moment, so that's a good start. Yes.
Have you got an image?
That's it. Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. So I made this point that the first thing I want to say is there are many valid and contradictory viewpoints. And now I'd like to show you some imagery, and I hope you can see it. So you will have seen this image before. This is the one I was talking about. This is the estate that was built in the late 60s, and this is a view of it when it was very new. You can see that the photographer, it's a professional photographer, they're focusing on the visuality, the physicality of the building. It's almost a sculpture. The children are a very interesting compositional afterthought, I would argue. Some people might find this beautiful, others might find it repellent, but it's one way of looking at these estates, literally. And then this is a different view. You might be surprised, but it is the same estate. About 20 years later, this time the photo has been taken by a resident, and it shows a sort of bucolic wonderland going on. You can hardly see any concrete at all. In the center of the image, which isn't great, there's a playground and some children. And what's going on here is this is a parent's eye view of the estate. They're looking down from their flat. They're in easy reach of their children for shouting at them or calling them into dinner. So two very different views of the one estate. And I'd like to show you a few more as well. Even within one time period and one age group, you can have quite different views. So these are some quotes from social media from people who grew up in this same estate in the 1980s and 1990s, from when they were children. So I'm calling them ex-children. And you can see that for one person, leaving the estate was the best thing that ever happened to them. For another person, the estate provided some of the best memories of their life, and they were proud they were raised there and had a lot of good times. And the other writers were also talking about very negative things and very positive things in different ways. So what I'm trying to say is there's no one story, and you need to look very carefully across a lot of different sources of information to build something that is justifiable and reasoned. So moving on now, point number 2 I'd like to make is also that judgments have to change over time. And that's particularly true when you're looking at the life of an investment like housing, which lasts for a very, very long time. And as I've said, some of these estates are getting on for 100 years old now and have passed through a great many different circumstances, great many different local and national contexts. They've been placed under different demands, and they're having to serve different expectations. And let's just look at housing quality as one example of that issue. So this is an image of a kitchen-bathroom combination in one of the estates in London. Picture was taken in 1936 by the proud LCC landlords of the estate. To modernise, it looks bizarre, quaint, perhaps even worrying or slum-like. But in fact, in 1936, this was a very high-quality arrangement. Most homes in the country didn't have these facilities: an indoor bath, fixed bath with hot water provided. And of course, for lower income people, working class people in London, this was extremely high standard accommodation. But you can see as time passes, those judgments are going to change. And let me show you another image making a similar point. This is another image of a London estate. It was taken by a resident. And what does it show? Well, at cursory glance, you might think this is some kind of image of urban degradation or some kind of problematic things that are going on. And it's true, there's very messy parking here. and there's play and conflict with washing and cars. But I'd like to argue what this picture really shows is that residents have got wealthier. And the people who built this building, the planners, didn't foresee that 50 years later, people would have their own dryers or they'd use the laundrette, and that working class residents would start to own cars and vans in significant numbers. So in a way, this is an image of progress and good things, but clearly the landlord and residents need to get together to reorganize the way that public space is working in this estate to make things look better and work better. So the next point I'd like to make is that social housing estates, which are traditionally in the UK in academic and political life seen as worlds apart, in fact operate as part of their local housing markets. They're not separate, and they're influenced by what goes on in other parts of their local areas, and in the national housing market as well to some extent. And let's look at what that means in housing quality terms. I'm not going to show you many graphs this evening because it's the evening, we don't need to look at too many graphs. But what this shows is the change in the estate's position in terms of their relative quality, what they could offer compared to other estates, going back from the 1960s to 2001, and each of the coloured lines is one of the estates. So it shows the percentage of households in the surrounding local authorities that had worse amenities than the estates, that didn't have things like fixed baths with hot water. And you can see that in 1961, substantial proportions of local housing was providing worse amenities than the estates. And in some cases, majorities of local homes didn't have what the estates could provide. And of course, some of those estates have been around since the 20s or 30s and have been providing decades of high standard accommodation by this point. But the chart goes very sharply downwards. So in relative terms, compared to the rest of the housing market in their areas, the estates were losing out. And it wasn't good enough anymore to have these amenities because everybody was getting them, and they needed to be able to offer something else if they weren't going to fall behind. So we've gone forwards and backwards on the numbers here. But the next point I'd like to make is that despite what I've said about there being all kinds of judgments you can make and how things change over time, I think you can definitely say that by the 1980s, critical masses of potential residents and current residents of these estates thought the estates were unsatisfactory when compared to local alternatives in the market. And this is in some ways a very familiar story about how social housing as a whole developed problems, or about particular estates went through a period of decline. But I'd like to try and argue something different, and this is really what my whole book is about. There is a story of fall, but there's also a story of rise as well, which comes afterwards. And I want to argue that although there was a process of decline in these estates up until into the 1980s, that doesn't mean that decline was inevitable or irreversible. But now I'll say a bit more about what happened in these particular places and why it happened and whether it was going to be sustained. As I say, the 20 estates all became unpopular in the late 70s and early 80s. And this is an image from that time from one of the estates in London. And you can see it doesn't look particularly attractive if you're a potential resident. There's all that graffiti. And if you look closely, you can see there's no glass in the windows on the staircases, and there's rubble lying around. And this sort of thing was going on in some estates, not a majority, a minority of all estates nationwide. And here's a more extreme image from the northeast, actually. In this estate here, you can see that the terrace is all boarded up. There's not enough demand for this type of housing in this neighbourhood in particular. And what else has happened? An extreme form of crime. Somebody has stolen the roofs of 2.5 of the houses there. They've taken the tiles to resell them. And this estate was plagued by this sort of problems of people stealing whole central heating systems and all kinds of things. So problems became quite extreme in some places. And along with unpopularity and crime, there were a lot of other issues that emerged. Because these 20 estates fell down, the hierarchy is not always a lot of fun. And let's go back to that estate I showed you earlier that had the vandalism and the windows knocked out. You can see here, these were the first kind of physical initiatives that local authorities took. And it's very small scale. So they've got local children to do a mural, but they haven't really got a grip on graffiti, and they haven't got glazing back in the windows. But local authorities, working with residents, carried out a whole series of minor initiatives, and some of them didn't work, and some of them it was one step forward and one step backward. And they tried lots of different sorts of things, and gradually, cumulatively, improved management, liaison with residents, and small investments, later on bigger investments, and some quite dramatic physical changes produced a lot of benefits. So this is the same estate now, 40 years later. So this was last year, in fact. And you can see there's quite a lot of things have gone on. The street's cleaner, there's better lighting, there's no graffiti, there's a door entry phone put onto the stair tower. The windows have been replaced by metal grills. There are new windows on the flats, they've got double glazing. And perhaps quite significantly, in the background you can see there's a new building there. So the old warehouse has been replaced by a big private sector, reflecting the fact that the housing market around this London estate has changed dramatically. A new invention, recycling, has been introduced, and as an aspect of the greater wealth of residents, there's a new issue of disposing of large-scale rubbish. So this is a whole range of things that are physical things, but there are lots of social things going on, and there's also contextual change happening as well. This is another of the estates in London in 1982, the deck access estate with very complicated routeways and hiding places, and this did have a serious crime problem. And this kind of estate made up a small group of the 20, and they all had quite drastic physical changes. Really, these could only take place in the late 1980s and in the 1990s, when government funding for this kind of work increased in scale. And here you see bridges have been removed, and there's private access now to homes, and a more standard streetscape, plus better lighting as well. And this is very much how the estate looks today. And in the 90s and into the 2000s, several of the estates had some kind of mixed tenure development, usually with some demolition and then replacement by private housing. This is another example in London, and ironically, they knocked down a block of social rented housing and built a private sector block, which is much higher than the social housing was. And in fact, this kind of process has become more and more the way that change is occurring in London estates. But this group of 20 estates mostly went through its changes before the latest versions of knockdown, rebuild type of regeneration. So I want to also point out to you that while pictures are great, they do tend to bias you towards physical change. And there were a whole lot of other changes that have taken place since the 1980s in the estates. They're really quite dramatic. And here is what's happened to resident unemployment levels over that period. So extremely high levels in the early 80s. But over 3 decades, you can see unemployment come down and get much closer, in fact, to national and local averages. And that's made a big difference to residents in the estates. They have more money. There's a different atmosphere, obviously. And there are a whole range of other sorts of change like that have gone on. the estates become more popular, which is part of the reason that maybe the populations have changed. In addition, quite stunning results in terms of what's gone on in local schooling. So in the 1990s, estate-linked schools were lagging behind local authority and national averages in terms of results by a long way. But by 2017, the gap had almost entirely closed, meaning that residents in estates had access to good education. And the crime situation has also changed very dramatically, so that when we surveyed residents in the mid-2000s, they felt the crime situation was no worse than the national average. So really dramatic transformations have gone on in the estates that have taken them quite a long way away from where they were in their worst times. And you can argue that there's been a real rise. It hasn't compensated fully for the change in the position of social housing as a whole, but these estates have improved relative to their local housing markets and relative to where they were in 1980, and it's made a difference for residents. And it's made such a difference that perhaps ironically, some residents groups have faded away because they have less to be angry or concerned about, and some housing organisations have removed their local offices and moved to area or regional offices because, again, they don't feel there's enough work for them to do. And this is a housing manager from the Northwest saying that residents are happy, things are very quiet, and the estate's just ticking over. And that's a far cry from the position that things were at some decades ago when there were real difficulties in that area. So this is really, to restate point number 2, judgments have to change over time. I feel that quite a lot of people in the general public and policymakers as well have got their judgments of social housing stuck some time ago, perhaps in the 1980s, the 1990s, or the 2000s, and they haven't caught up with the important changes that there have been. And what were and are some of the less successful parts of social housing are actually by now relatively successful, and that's an important story for policy, for people's sense of themselves, because the stigma is a real burden for residents of some areas that have a bad name, and the name is no longer justified by evidence. And it's also an issue for housing theory. So it's long been argued that in terms of housing in neighbourhoods generally decline, except for a few eccentric cases that go through gentrification. Housing estates also generally decline. So I'll just check the quote here, but Alison Rivette said, "The communist estate biography is a hopeful beginning which provides a long remembered golden age, followed by a gradual or sometimes sudden decline." And I think if you'd stopped the clock with these estates in 1980 or 1990, Alison Rivette would have been right, but it's no longer true. So social housing and the less successful estates have gone through a fall, but we must recognise there's now been a rise again. And my final point, number 6 tonight, is to say that many factors that have driven these falls and rises in these particular estates lie well beyond them. So we can get quite focused on the idea that perhaps there's details of design or something about resident groups or population mix that is driving all of this. And I'm sure that plays an important part, and these estates show that. But on the other hand, there are factors in the local housing market at national level and global level that are really driving what's gone on. And I would argue that there was something special going on in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s that made life more difficult for the less popular housing estates. They were vulnerable to the problems that came along at that time. And I'm just going to show a couple of bits of evidence to illustrate that, and then I'll stop. So it's not often recognised, but at national level in the UK and in many other countries in the world, there was a crime boom in the 1980s and early 1990s, and then that has since then been dying away for many, many years. And you can see here a chart of what percentage of people from different, what percentage of people were victims of different crimes, rising up to 15% of people annually a victim of car crime in the early 1990s, the yellow line there. So when these 20 estates were first having their difficult problems, they were down at the left-hand end of the chart, but about to go into a national crime wave. They were vulnerable to it because of their design, their unpopularity, having empty homes, being badly managed, all kinds of issues. And they suffer badly, but they've now been able to get into a position through physical change and management change and so on, where they can benefit from this long-term decline in crime that we've all experienced since that point. And finally, I'd like to return to this chart that shows what's going on with unemployment. So I think in this chart, which describes what's happening for residents of particular estates, you can also see a strong regional story. And it links into the economic history of Britain as a whole. So the three estates that had the very highest unemployment in 1981 were all in the northeast. And the northeast was particularly seriously affected by deindustrialization that was going on at that time. And they've since then, those regions and those estates have got over that through a long and painful process, and you can see those lines have come down. Some estates experienced a rise in unemployment between 81 and 91, and most of those were the London estates. London had a particularly bad impact from the recession of the early 1990s, and you can really see that in this chart as well. But since that time, all regions have experienced reduced unemployment, and you can see that the estates are benefiting from that national and local change as well. I'm going to make one final point, which is quite esoteric, which is that through most of the history of the 20th century, local authorities and public politicians were very much convinced they needed to build lots more housing because there wasn't enough, and that was certainly true. But ironically, there was a pause in demand for social housing, particularly in the biggest cities, around the late 70s, early 80s. A combination of the perfect storm of counter-urbanization, moving out of cities, the continued effect of the building programme, and then lastly, greater access to home ownership for working class people. So again, at this crucial time around the 70s and 80s, there was something going on nationwide and in particular regions as well that caused a loss of demand. But that loss of demand was very temporary, and it's come back with a vengeance. And that's also part of the story about how these estates are stronger. People are willing to pay huge amounts of money to rent privately or buy in or next to the estates, particularly those in London. And that also changes the way that they work socially and economically and politically, because the estates are housing markets. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back and stop being a small egg now. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Rebecca. But it should be now a round of applause, but unfortunately we can't hear all our attendees. But thank you very much indeed for that. Now, you made 3 or 4 points right at the end, and your voice went suddenly obscured by the technology, and we heard when you said lastly, we heard that bit, but there were a couple of points before that. I don't know if you can recall what they were and maybe say them again. Is that possible? Or
can I just check? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, now it's gone perfectly fine. There was just I would say 30 or 40 seconds when it became rather garbled.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure which bit it was.
Right at the end. You said
I was talking about. Oh, I was talking about changing patterns of demand for social housing. Did you hear that?
That was it. That was the bit. Yes, I think that was.
Okay. Yes. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
it's a slightly complex argument, but there was for most of the 20th century and in the 21st century, there's been a lot of demand for affordable housing, and there's always been demand for any social housing that is built or becomes available. But there was one period where that was less true, especially in certain places, and it was the places where these estates were, and some other estates that became unpopular. So these estates are all located in the biggest cities, and in the late 70s and early 80s, they were experiencing, they'd been building council housing for a long time and had a lot of it. Populations were moving out of the big cities, and it was getting easier for working class people to get into home ownership. So in certain cities, there was just a temporary dip in demand for council housing, and it tended to affect whichever estates were at the bottom of the local hierarchy worst. So there was quite a dramatic effect on these estates from this temporary problem of a pause in demand, but it's long since gone away, and these estates are benefiting from the voracious demand for affordable housing of all kinds anywhere.
Thank you very much. Now, I would remind people to put their questions into the Q&A and we'll follow them up. So there's a good number there to keep us going. But just before we go to the questions on the Q&A panel, were the estates you're looking at impacted by right to buy, and did that affect the quality of, I mean, levels of crime or any of the other aspects of the estates?
Well, the right to buy came in 1980, and it had almost no impact at all on these 20 estates for the first 20 years of its existence. They were unpopular. People didn't think it was a safe option to buy in these areas. Residents were on lower incomes, there's very high levels of unemployment, and also compared to houses, which the majority nationwide. But from the 2000s, sorry, the right to buy took off in these estates. So I think what were in 1995, when I started on the project, 20 unpopular council estates, I think you can now say are fairly popular mixed tenure areas. Tenures mixed through the right to buy and also through some estate redevelopment schemes as well.
Yeah, so somebody has actually put a question, I see, about right to buy. And so their question is, has right to buy helped to establish not just mixed tenure and mixed income communities, but more balanced and economically diverse and successful communities? Do you think its impact has actually been positive?
Well, thanks for your question. It is very difficult to say because I personally don't have individual data tracking through who bought, what their characteristics were, what they did, how they behaved. But from talking to residents groups and talking to local housing managers, there is quite a lot of variation between different estates, particularly between regions. But most of them say the right to buy has not been great, because what it's led to in most cases is a substantial private rented sector, which is difficult to manage and can cause problems with large numbers of residents, antisocial behaviour, poor management, and so on. So it's a mixed picture, but it's certainly not true to say that mixed tenure through the right to buy has been an unmitigated blessing.
Right, thank you. So now Joe East is asking, is there a similar overview in Europe or beyond? Is the perception of states similar elsewhere?
Oh, Joe, thank you very much for that question as well. There have been a number of studies of post-war housing estates, usually focusing on ones with non-traditional design across Europe. And they do tend to show the same things, that while some estates became problematic in the second or third decade of their lives, things have normalized gradually over time as they have been better integrated into their local markets.
Thanks. Now, Claire Richards asks, has there continued to be a north-south divide over time? For example, in areas of continued unemployment in the northeast. Claire spent the 80s and 90s actually filming documentaries in those estates. So what's your response to that?
Oh, thanks again, Claire. I'd love to be able to chat with you and chat with all the questioners properly about your experience and your views. There is a very strong regional pattern, and regional housing markets vary widely, and in fact have grown more different over time if you're looking at house values. But on the other hand, the strength of the economy over the 2000s in particular, and the growth of the housing market over that period did stretch to every corner. And in fact, there is strong demand for social housing across the northeast. The owner occupation has become very expensive, and the social housing stock has diminished through sales and also through demolitions. So at the moment, there's plenty of demand for it. It's quite a different picture to how it might have been some decades ago.
Thanks. Now, David Allardyce asks, are there any significant or interesting differences between these estates, and can that be put down to local authority policy or external factors such as local employment?
Thank you again, a brilliant question. There are many differences between the estates, and as I said, there are many different experiences within estates and different stories you could tell if you looked at particular issues, whether you're interested in community life or older people or employment or whatever. So there are a lot of differences, and really I was struggling all the way through writing the reports and finally the book more recently, every time between telling 20 stories and trying to generalize to some extent. And obviously in this short time I've not done justice to it, but certainly individual local authority policies could make a big difference. For example, some of the estates started off with quite high rents and restrictive allocations policies because local authorities were deciding to protect certain new and high quality parts of their stock. In other cases, local authorities purposely sent the most difficult residents to these estates because they were trying to protect some other stock somewhere else. So those are just two examples from the mid 20th century, but there are hundreds, including many good things the local authorities have done as well.
Thanks. Now, Mark Tomlinson asks, is the policy and attention from the local authority more important than the original architecture and urban form of these estates? And can a good local authority overcome bad design?
Yes, I think good management and good policy can make a success of any design. Several of these estates, as I said, were of traditional design, houses with front gardens and back gardens, and still have plenty of problems. I think what local authority policy can't overcome is lack of demand when that happens, and it can't overcome lack of resources. So one of the stories of these estates and many others like them, and arguably all social housing, is that after the initial investment in high quality homes, there were long periods where these estates and others like them did not receive any investment. And you saw that graph of their relative quality advantage dropping away. If you were managing stock with an eye to retaining its value, you would put investment in over those later years to provide extra things. And local authorities and central government did eventually do this, but it was very laggardly, patchy. So they provided central heating for homes that had originally been heated by coal fires. They put double glazing in eventually, but it was a long and patchy process, and full of conflict between central and local government, and not the planned, well-organised, forward-thinking approach you would have liked to see.
I have Elena Congreve, who asks, I wonder how Grenfell impacted on your estates, both those with problematic cladding or a wider concern about taller buildings and fire safety.
Thanks again for the question, and hello, I know, Elena, nice to hear from you. There wasn't a direct impact in the sense that none of these estates had problematic cladding, which is something to be very thankful for. I think there was a direct impact in the sense that I think social housing residents throughout the country felt frightened by Grenfell and felt it was a symbol of their neglected status, perhaps, relative to other voters and other residents. None of these estates have had to have any of the mitigation measures that some other tall buildings have had to have because of the fire risk. So they got away with it. But that's just part of the very varied story of housing nationwide.
So Lena has an additional question, and she says it would be worth checking what happens to educational attainment in your estates with the current break in schooling, where children in private school are being taught in lessons. Those in state schools depend on education levels and the time available of their parents to maintain their progress.
Yes, I think educational services are very, very important as part of what your housing and your neighbourhood gives you. There was a noticeable advance in what the estates were getting from their local areas, particularly over the 2000s, with investment, for example, in new school buildings, new leisure centres, and so on. So I think, again, that's part of the argument that what goes on in estates isn't only due to what's in the estate, but the wider social policy is important. So policies to reduce gaps in educational outcomes between richer and poorer people, more and less deprived areas, policies to reduce health inequalities are going to have effects on social housing and on estates. And the converse as well. If those gaps increase, there's going to be an impact on these residents.
Thanks. Now, Angela Forty asks, how is the demand for social housing at the present moment, and what are the differences between the different areas?
Thank you. There's really quite strong demand throughout the UK for social housing. It's part of a long-term problem throughout the housing market that we're not building enough to keep up with population demand, household growth, and the growth of space that each household wants as well. And that's combined with a long-term, very low growth in average incomes, and the door to home ownership being shut off for more people in more places. And that's only going to be added to by the current coronavirus process and its effects over the next months and years.
Now, Christian Keepers wonders why are none of the estates identified? Thanks,
that's another great question. When Ampower first visited the estates, they had reputations, and people were anxious about talking to researchers or journalists for fear that the reputations might only be added to by irresponsible stories. In some cases as well, residents or staff wanted to complain about each other or about senior staff. So from the fact that things were so problematic early on meant that it was important to promise anonymity to interviewees, and the best way to really convince them of that was not even to name the estates or the local authority areas in which the estates are located. And we've just kept with that promise all the way through. The truth is that by now, people are not feeling so sensitive, and some interviewees in the most recent round I did actually wanted to be named, wanted their pictures to be used. But still, the promise to the original people still matters.
Yes, well, this era of social media has changed a lot of people's views about confidentiality in that respect, hasn't it? Well, it's appropriate that our next one is an anonymous questioner, but they're asking what has been the effect of estate regeneration on the estates you've looked at, and how has it been received by the residents living there?
Well, looking at these estates, there are many stories of estate regeneration. Each estate has got its own story, and each estate has been subject to many different programs, policies, ideas. And I would argue that overall, they've had a positive effect on the estates as neighbourhoods and on the residents who are involved. There's been, like with all the other improvement efforts, there's been quite a lot of wastage along the way. So investments that were made that didn't achieve all the results, or people experiencing difficulties like being moved out of their homes and moved back again, who probably, you know, might have been some other way of doing it. But overall, there've been positive effects. There needed to be some kind of investment, and it's happened through a whole series of area-based initiatives and policies with strings attached. But in general, I would say it's had a good effect. These estates, these 20 estates, went through different generations of change, and mostly weren't involved in the most recent changes there've been in London, which have involved dramatic demolition and densification, and failure in many cases to replace social housing with the same numbers, and not necessarily taking account of what happens to residents who are displaced and whether they're better off or not. Most of these estates managed to go through their regeneration processes in a previous generation. But regeneration, or investment rather than regeneration, is an ongoing process. So one question I have is what will happen to them next, and when they need the next round of improvements. So they've all had decent homes improvements, for example, which has happened nationwide and provided new windows, heating, kitchens, bathrooms. Those improvements are now aging, and what kind of deals, what kind of arrangements, what kind of compromises will estates and their residents and their owners have to make to do the next round of investment?
Great. Now, Caroline Daly asks, are there any design features of these estates that you consider to have been particularly successful or particularly unsuccessful in contributing to or detracting from residents' experiences of living there?
Well, thanks again for that question. There's a lot of variety, as I've said, and this group of estates, or any group of estates that have had problems, puts the lie to the most basic and simple kinds of architectural determinism, because, as I said, estates of houses have had problems, just like some flatted estates have. I would say that there have been particular problems with some system-built houses in some of these estates, where there were quite high numbers had to be demolished. Although there were low numbers built, high numbers of those were demolished in certain estates in the north of England in particular. There were problems with deck access estates like the one I showed you, and the incremental changes were tried in those estates with management and resident involvement and attempts to provide entry phones and things, but in the end most of those estates had very expensive and disruptive changes to their design to simplify access routes and so on. So there seemed to be no way round those kind of problems. One thing I would like to say about design issues is that while the estates lost their edge quite quickly compared to other local housing, when it came to basic amenities, the same was not true when it came to space. So the space standards these estates were built under varied a lot, different time periods, different regulations, and different decisions by local authorities. And some estates had several different sort of regimes of space standards even within them, as the finances changed year on year with a central government deal on subsidies. But it's quite noticeable that where estates were built with quite spacious homes, that's an advantage they haven't lost out on over time. The private sector and a newer building has not been able to compete on space with high quality council housing from early in the 20th century or middle 20th century. So that's a lasting legacy, and I think there's a lesson there perhaps.
Very good. So recently Rosario asked, and this is a little bit similar to the previous question, but what are the typologies, low-rise, tower blocks, mixed use, etc., that worked better during the time of research without the need of substantial renovation?
Well, as I said, it was a mixed picture. All the types of estates that included in the 20 had problems. Houses, low-rise blocks of flats that you could walk up, and high-rise estates or estates with mixed development and deck access. So they all had various problems, but different problems. So the deck access estates had problems with their heating systems and with infestation, for example, sound conductivity. The estates of houses, depending on when they were built and how well they were built, had problems of poor insulation and then needing to be upgraded from open fires to more modern heating systems. We see this sort of happening through the generations. Each had a different sort of problem that might emerge at a different age and then require different sorts of investment. So there's a lot of diversity, and you might almost argue that there's too much diversity in the details of building and the history of social housing. It's probably got the most diverse kind of architecture and the most diverse engineering behind it of all housing tenures.
Thanks. Now, number 117793, that sounds very 1984, but they're asking, do you see a difference between the rise of new housing association stock and existing local authority stock, which is often older and in poorer condition? And could this lead to a two-tier style of social housing?
Well, thanks. That's a really helpful question, because one point I didn't raise when I was talking was about the mix of tenure between social housing tenures. So all these estates started off built by, owned by, managed by councils, but now only 2 of them are still owned and managed by councils. Housing associations have come in to take over council housing. Housing associations have also built within some estates, and in some cases they or other organisations manage the estates. So in some ways it's like the story of the right to buy. There was no impact of this kind of tenure diversification for decades, and then suddenly there was a rush in the 2000s, and the council ownership and council management faded away under a whole series of transformations that were all about trying to get more investment into housing, trying to reorganize management. They had whole stocks or part of their stocks to housing associations, principally in order to get investment, transferring management to ALMOs for the same reason, kinds of new arrangements with private sector managers, tenant management organisations, and so on. So there's been a sudden burst of diversification. But what that means nationwide is that there's much less difference now between the council housing and housing association stock. Housing association stock is now the bigger group, and because it's done so much taking over of council stock, there's not much to do. One thing I would say about investment, is able to get access to private funds. But
sorry, we lost about the last 15 seconds of what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
so
right.
what was it? Has it been a good thing or a bad thing for housing associations to become owners and managers of these estates? to these estates, and particularly to their neighbouring estates. So that these ones that have been taken over have a sense that they got left out in the process. But it's also been part of an ironic increase in the scale of organisations. So local big housing managers, 100,000 each, and London boroughs are very big landlords. Sorry. And,
your voice is getting slightly garbled in the internet somewhere. But,
oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It may be garbled in my brain.
No, not at all. Not at all.
It's very noticeable that housing associations have moved well away from estate management or local management, and they're now conducting regional management. So whereas some of these estates used to have at some time an office in the estate, they got moved down the road, it's then moved to the centre of the borough, and it's now in another county. And that's some consequence of moving to housing association management.
Great. Now, another anonymous attendee says, despite best intentions, it appears that fundamentally many post-war estates are aesthetically and emotionally deficient in terms of design quality and human scale. Do you agree?
No. Sorry. I think the aesthetic judgment is a very personal one, and I don't want to make that judgment on behalf of anybody else. I think there are people who would fall on either side of the fence. If you go back to the very first images that I showed, I think that might be a case study of this sort of estate and how different people can see it differently. So perhaps a professional photographer taking an image for an architectural magazine can see a beautiful abstract sculpture. Others might think it's very nasty indeed. But meanwhile, a parent looking out of the window, it sees home and children and family.
Now, Malcolm asks, do you think that housing associations such as Peabody and Guinness, for example, have been more successful with social housing than local authorities in delivering and maintaining it?
Well, Peabody and Guinness are special housing associations because they've kept well, Peabody in particular has kept a London focus. And that's meant that there are certain limits to the scale of management that they can get involved with. Peabody has kept more of a local management focus than I think a lot of other housing associations have. Guinness is now part of a larger group, and those big housing associations need to work in terms of economies of scale when it comes to borrowing money, but they've tended also to operate in terms of economies of scale everywhere else through their operation in order to valiantly continue building large numbers of homes. But that has had an impact on their relations with existing tenants and the ability of those tenants to speak to someone and to sort out problems. And I must say that I'm personally concerned about housing management as it's operating at the moment. I spent some time, as Peter said, running a course for housing managers at the LSE. And that course doesn't exist anymore because landlords are not interested in supporting students to go through a course like that. So I think what happened in the late 70s and 80s to estates like this is a warning of what can happen if you don't focus on management. And what's happened in the decades after is a lesson about the painful, slow, inexpensive process of trying to put some of those problems right. And coronavirus, again, has shown that many national systems were quite efficient, but didn't have much slack to deal with emergencies and problems. And I'm concerned that British social housing management, as it is at the moment, doesn't have much slack. It's quite an efficient operation, but it can be costly in the long run if you don't have people on the ground to spot emerging problems. And this could happen at any time. I think Grenfell illustrates that issue as much as the history of these 20 estates does.
Thanks. Now we've got two questions from Daryl Chen. Daryl asks, can you say whether an estate success is most impacted by local issues or macro socio-economic factors? And his second question is, when was the last time that we had the same kind of demand for social housing, and what can we learn from them?
Thanks. Two more good questions. Thank you. It's very hard to say whether local or national factors have more effect. I think they both work together. And each of these 20 estates has a different story about that relative mix. And again, depending when you stop the clock, you get a different answer at each time. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to do any better than that, but to say you need to be aware of both of those factors and not put all your attention to one or the other. On the issue of demand for social housing, throughout most of the 20th century, there was strong demand for social housing, and there was supply. For that reason, it was shock in the late 70s, some places, to let certain days.
Sorry, we've lost most of that bit. We got as far as you starting to answer the question, but you garbled a bit.
Sorry, it must be very infuriating. I'm not experiencing these problems at this end.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. I would say that in general there is demand for affordable housing, and that's been true for nearly all of now. There's always going to be people for whom there's a gap between their income and the housing market prices for housing, and housing is taking up more of our incomes than it used to. Food used to be a very dominant aspect of the budgets of poorer people. Food's become much cheaper for everybody, but housing is a burden for society. Housing costs take up a bigger and bigger chunk. So that suggests that the demand for affordable housing is just going to carry on growing.
Good. Well, we're running a little bit over time, so just one last question, and our audience being very good in providing lots of good questions, and you've done really clear and succinct answers, so thank you. So our last one is from an anonymous attendee again. I would be interested in whether the longevity of individuals' residencies in each estate has changed over time.
Oh, I'm sorry to end like this, but that's a great question that I don't know the answer to, and I would love to know the answer. Certainly, the idea of people moving in and moving out quickly has often been used as an indicator of problems and of unpopularity. But even in so-called less popular estates like these 20, there's always been a minority of residents who've lived for a very long time in those estates. And they tend to form special groups within the community. They often be particularly involved in community organisations. But every neighbourhood has a diversity. Some people who move in and out quickly, and some people who stay for longer. And I just don't have enough individual records to be able to tell a more concrete story. I did manage that for one estate, and found that despite it being extremely unpopular at one point, there were old people who've been there since its origins in the 20s, and were just carrying on sticking it out.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. That's been a really fascinating talk, and I'm very pleased we were able to arrange it through the benefits of modern technology. There's a few little interruptions now and then, but that was very helpful, very clear, and thank you to our audience for attending, and also for all those very lively questions. So thank you very much, Rebecca, much appreciated. And we should have a round of applause, but I'm afraid we can't do that again either, but nevertheless, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And can I thank you, Peter, and thank everybody who's come. And if you've got any more questions that didn't get answered, just email me, becky.tunstall@york.ac.uk.
Really good. Thank you.